It's great to have you all here again, and we're looking forward to, Roy speaking again, taking us through the second half of his talk. So I'm just going to hand straight over to you, Roy, and let you go from here.
Thank you. Welcome back. And I hope that we can engage and interact on some of the things that were shared in that first session, but more particularly things from this second session. I concluded by saying that we stand at a crossroads like Jeremiah's day. And Jeremiah, I think, gets a bad press. He's regarded as the depressive prophet. He's somebody who certainly faces the reality. And I find myself a little bit identifying with him. You know, when I hear some church leaders talk about, oh, it's all going to be okay now, we're just going to get back to normal, it'll be fine. And to me, they speak of the contemporaries of Jeremiah's who were saying, peace, peace, when there was no peace. The world is being shaken. And I think we do stand at crossroads. But Jeremiah was not the pessimist. He actually went on in the book of Jeremiah. You can read about it. He brings a future and a hope. He talks about God bringing a future and a hope, but actually it was finding a future and a hope in a different place. It was finding in a place of exile. It was learning how to sing the Lord's song in a strange land. The old familiar ways were no longer going to pertain to the new situation. And no kind of looking back in order to be kind of somehow romantic or, you know, just reminiscent and nostalgic and yearning for. No, it's actually about discovering what God was saying and doing in the new place in which they found themselves. We all view life through different paradigms and lenses. And I want us to view our lens through that of exile and the experience of the Celtic saints who found themselves in a period of history when the church was in exile. And I've shared this story a number of times, but when I moved to Wooler in the Cheviot Hills of North Northumberland, which is near the Scottish border, over nearly 30 years ago now, I moved with my wife and my 4 children. And in the top attic room of our terraced house, there was a large wooden toy chest. And for my 2 youngest children, Joshua and Francesca, their eyes, you know, just saw this thing, and their like eyes were popping out their heads. This large, colourful toy chest, and they opened the top of the chest, and they dug out all these like things they'd never seen before. There were bits of clockwork railway. There were old dinky cars. There were educational toys, which basically meant you had a little man on a pole and you put bits of his body in and then you decapitated him. Good educational toys of the 1950s. And as I was watching on, I was seeing my children discover new things, whereas I, as their watching parent, was rediscovering things that were part of my inheritance, my childhood. And for a lot of people, when it comes to Celtic spirituality and the experience of the Celtic saints, that period in history from the 5th through to the 7th, 8th century, when God raised up a movement that were called the Celtic saints, what we're discovering today is people unearthing their stories, unearthing their spirituality. And I describe it like a treasure chest that might speak powerfully into our contemporary situation today. So I just want to run through some of these characteristics of the Celtic saints that might shed light and bring inspiration and illumination and wisdom by which we might live today. You cannot interpret or understand the lives of the Celtic saints without recognizing that their roots are to be found in the desert monastic tradition of the church. Theirs was a wisdom tradition. We live in a culture and a world which has esteemed information and knowledge to be the great thing. We just, you know, tap into Google, just get information, you know, produce policy reports and documents and initiatives and strategies. But what I would suggest that we can learn from both the desert monastic tradition and Celtic spirituality, which was like applied desert spirituality, is wisdom by which to live. Jen led us in that lovely meditation, almost like a mindfulness exercise, a contemplative exercise. What the Celts did is they had this balance and rhythm, this equilibrium between prayer and action, between contemplation and engagement with the world. Now, that's a great challenge for you YWAMers, because just basically, your action men and women. You just do stuff. You've all got the genes of Jen, who just kind of like just wants to, we're doing lots of stuff. But actually what Jen has learned in recent years is the wisdom that comes from silence and solitude that informs our engagement and our activity, our involvement with others. Rowan Williams, who's the former Archbishop of Canterbury, has just released a new book on learning from the East, the Orthodox way, a different approach to understanding of heaven and earth, the connectedness between the environment and the earth upon which we stand and are called to tread gently, and the world in which we live. There's much to be learned from the roots of Celtic spirituality that are to be found in the Orthodox traditions of the church. Discipleship was a really clear thing. It seems to me that, it's not, it sounds like a simple jibe, but it's not. But, so much of my time as a minister of the gospel has seen people put so much emphasis on, managing and building and planting churches. And if we put the same amount of time and energy into embracing the Great Commission, which was to go and make disciples. It wasn't to plant churches, it was to go and make disciples. Churches come into being as people encounter Jesus and become his disciples. But it seems to me as if we've got the cart before the horse. And what the Celts did is they were a movement of discipleship, of spiritual formation, that engaged the landscape of what we in Northumbria community talk about, the landscape of the heart, the inner landscape. Proverbs 4:23, pay attention to your heart, for from it flows life. And those major life issues of money, sex, and power are addressed in relationship with God and being a disciple of Jesus. Strong emphasis upon community, the arena where the fruit of the Spirit is expressed, where relationships with God and with one another is known. The fragmentation of contemporary society, the inability to either live with ourselves and live with our neighbor, particularly if they're different, is a stark reality. And the good news of the gospel is that actually not only are we reconciled to God, but reconciled to one another. And it seems to me that one of the great strengths of YWAM and other organizations and movements like YWAM is that capacity to build, to nurture, and to model and to give expression to what the community of Jesus, or what the Quakers describe as the society of friends, looks like in our changing, hostile, partisan world, where the welcoming of the stranger, looking for Christ in the stranger's guise, being hospitable. Hospitality, I think that's one of the themes that you're looking at in this series of videos and lectures. The strong relational element. I don't know if anybody else is like me, but I'm just absolutely sick to the back teeth of programs, running programs. I mentor and I train people for church ministry, and I say to them, if I get the occasion to speak at certainly in their early weeks of training and as they conclude their training, and some at their ordinations and inductions, God has not called you to be a project manager running the programs of the church. We need to recapture relationships mattering above all things. What we do should flow out of our relationship with God and one another. Whereas often we have programs that people have to fit into in order to make the institutional thing kind of work. And we need to rediscover that at the heart of the gospel is relationship with God and one another and our neighbor. Celtic spirituality was also infused with incarnational thought and practice, spirituality. The essence of their spirituality was incarnational engagement where they were. So they drew most of their inspiration. You'll know, those of you who live in Ireland, that many of the Celtic crosses in Ireland from the kind of 5th, 6th, 7th century were actually carvings of the Gospels. And the most favored Gospel carvings, inscriptions, were that of John's Gospel, because it was from John's Gospel and the Johannine tradition, as opposed to the Petrine tradition, that the Celtic saints derived inspiration from. So John 1:14, the Word becoming flesh and dwelling among us, full of grace and truth. The Jesus who, appears and, talks to some guys and then goes down to a wedding at Cana in Galilee, is a Jesus who is engaged, living in the world. And I think one of the things that COVID and the pandemic has done is has given us opportunity to really be engaged with our neighbors in our neighborhoods, and to rediscover community, to rediscover solidarity with our neighbor, that we're not isolationists. You quoted the poet, it's John Donne, another poet, who said, "No man is an island." We were not made, if we're made in the image of God, we're made for community. Those of you from Africa know well the whole concept of Ubuntu. I think the Celts modeled in their kind of expression of being together as a community more models of synagogue rather than temple. I was a church minister in local churches for nearly 14 years before founding with others the Northumbria community. And I think back now, so much of church practice is rooted in a kind of temple model. People go off to the temple on a Sunday. People go off to their public service on the Sunday. People go off and then just get on with their lives the rest of the week. I think in these, I realize synagogue is not spelt correctly there on that presentation, misprint. But I think we have a great opportunity to rediscover synagogue, to rediscover, if you like, church and community in the home, in the missional communities, in the places where people are gathering, not in those places that are the religious buildings. In fact, the church that I was involved in pioneering way back in the 1980s in Teesside, they're discussing at the moment whether their building is superfluous to their needs, or if they have a building, it's far more use to the community and running things like the baby bank than is their need to be meeting in it on a Sunday. Missional listening to the heartbeat of God, listening to what the Spirit of God is doing in our neighborhoods, beyond the walls of the church, looking for the kingdom of God in the streets, and then responding and going where God is doing things rather than decreeing how God should do things and what God should be doing. Missional listening, kinship, friendship. I think one of the greatest gifts that we can give to one another in the world is the gift of friendship and of kinship and of support. The leadership models within the Celtic tradition, for example, the abbots and abbesses guarding the ethos, ensuring that communities lived what they taught, embracing their monastic rules of life. And then the bishops who were the wanderers, the peregrinati, who were those who journeyed for the love of God, sharing and taking the good news. Women, I mean, the Celtic Church would look askance at the debates that have gone on in recent years within our own church, contemporary church circles. They would kind of go, well, what's the issue? The issue, or if they did have a point of view, they would say this is actually more about power than anything else, rather than gender. They planted the gospel and they allowed the church and community to emerge. It seems to me that so much of our efforts have been on kind of, like, we need to plant a church, let's get a building, let's gather, let's meet, let's worship, let's, get people in, and then reach out and then attract them in. And it just seems to me that what the Celts did is so helpful for our changing contemporary society. When we're almost in, when I was at Bible college, it wasn't called missiology, it was called mission studies, back in the 1970s, where 3 generations removed from any real association with church and Christianity, you had a missionary situation. That's a great opportunity. I find it so much easier talking to the tradesmen here, none of whom have had any experience of church whatsoever, just impressions that they've formed from people that they've worked with or churches that they've been commissioned to do some work on. I find it so easy to share with them about the good news of Jesus because it was a missionary situation. And it's about sharing the good news of the gospel, not saying, right, in order for you to hear this good news of the gospel, you need to come to a church service. Because there's no way that these guys that I have got to know, some of whom have become friends, are going to step over the threshold of any church buildings into a culture that is so alien from their way of thinking and understanding life, let alone faith. The Celts had a very holistic, there was no sacred secular divide to their spirituality. They had a deep appreciation of nature and you know, when all the issues about global warming and climate change and the crisis of environment, the biodiversity, the economy, the ecology, Celtic spirituality speaks not as pantheistic, but of a deep appreciation of God and what God has created. There was the embracing of the arts for the Celtic saints. They used their arts to help them discover their human potential. Everybody is creative. Anybody who's made in the image of God is therefore creative. And I think our Western, certainly methods of education have often been suppressing of creativity. The Bible was really key. The Bible shaped their lives and the way in which they responded to the challenges and issues of their day. I was just reading about the different, not Celts, the Levelers. The Levelers were a very radical group of people who, in the time of the English, we didn't have a civil war. We had an industrial revolution. We were kind of kept from having a civil war officially. And the Levelers were people in the midst of all the unrest that was going on in 18th century Britain. They were kind of saying, actually, there has to be a different way in which we live. And the inspiration for many of the Levelers was the Bible itself. And the Bible shaped and gave a worldview that led to good things happening for the rebuilding of society. The care for the poor. One of the things that I was reflecting on, I was down in the south of England preaching last week, was thinking about the story in Luke's gospel about the Good Samaritan and the righteous Pharisee, and thinking about the conversation with my tradesman and this challenge about the church. Where is the church? It's actually, I think, what society in the chaos and crisis that we're in, I think what society needs more than anything is for us as disciples of Jesus to be the Good Samaritan rather than the righteous Pharisees. I leave that with you to ponder and reflect on. Signs and wonders were part of the experience of the Celtic saints, and yet they were rooted in ordinary. They saw miracles and signs and wonders, but they didn't run off and issue a whole video conference about how to do this and how to do that. They just got on with stuff. They were rooted in ordinary, everyday life. It stops us from becoming religious fruitcases, you know. They were wanderers for the love of Christ. They wandered for the love of Christ. They were not settlers. If God called them to go somewhere, they went. And they went with the support of their communities. And there was, finally, in conclusion, there was in the wisdom of Celtic spirituality, both stability, which was their rootedness in God, and movement. There are lots of movements that are emerging, many of which are quite frightening, particularly in the political spectrum and in the religious spheres. But there are also movements spearheaded often by younger people in relation to the environment and ecology. Some of the more radicalized movements are very disturbing. Movements need good roots. And what Celtic spirituality was, it was a movement of the Holy Spirit that affected change and transformation, which was eventually to shape European civilization for good, but it was rooted, it had stability in the rootedness of God. And I think the challenge for those of us who are kind of activists, my background is unchurched background, then came to faith outside of the church, and then pitched into charismatic and evangelical circles, was actually movement, activity, engagement, and busyness, and thinking that's the way to get on with life. And then you take a look at Jesus and you see this lovely balance between prayer and action, between contemplation and engagement, or in these words, stability and movement. Thomas Merton, I close. Thomas Merton was not a Celt, but he did give a lecture that I listened to on a tape. He recorded it in the late 1960s. And the only infuriating thing is he talked about the Celtic Saints, but I needed to inform him that's a football team. But anyway, bless him. He talked about the Celts, and he observed the Celts. He saw them as communities of hope. And I conclude with this: in a world of doing, they put the emphasis on being. In a world of frenetic activity, contemplation. In a world of complexity, simplicity. In a world of fragmentation, unity and diversity. In a world of individualism, they expressed community. In a world of greed, there seemed to be generosity. In a world of pace, the Sabbath rest. In a 24/7 world, that's interesting, that's not a new phrase, the Celts had rhythm. Where there was power, they brought servanthood. In a world that favored the rich, they reminded themselves and others of God's heart for the poor. And in a world of risk aversion, they were adventurers. And in a world of protocol, my goodness, these are nearly 50 years ago, with all health and safety and protocol and policy decisions, the Celts were men and women who were passionate for love of God. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Roy, for your presentation. And I think, Mike has been recording this, and in the coming week, it'll be put up on the ELLC website. And there'll be time there for people in your bases to unpack what he's talked about, because I feel like we could probably spend a week unpacking some of those lessons from the Celtic Saints there, Roy. So thanks so much for your presentation. What we're going to do now is break up into breakout rooms, not breakup rooms, breakout rooms. And I'm going to put a couple of questions in the chat here, which are just very simple questions. I think Mike is putting it on a slide. And just, feel free in your breakout room to follow wherever the conversation leads. If there's things that Roy said, follow on from him, talk about it, and just talk among yourselves. But these two questions that I've just put up, you should see it in your chat box. Maybe a way that you could begin the conversation. How do we move on in post-COVID times, if you want to call this post-COVID, without picking up everything that we had pre-COVID? What are those consumerist, individualist ways that we want to leave behind? How do we more go into community, and etc.? And then what can YWAM offer to Europe in these days of change? So I think we have, how long did we say? 15 minutes, Mike? Is that right, Tova? So Mike is going to put you into groups and just encourage you to join those groups and have rich conversation. And we'll see you back after that for a short panel discussion, and then I'm going to share some closing words.
But I think this talk with Roy has just been absolutely amazing. I have taken notes and scribbled, and I bet you have as well. So I just want to say right now, we'll just have a few minutes where it's possible to give feedback, have comments, questions. But I suggest you just stick up a hand, and then Mike is gonna unmute you. So if you can just say, let's say the first couple of minutes here, what was a major takeaway or major thing that you want to hold on to and take from this talk of Roy's. You can also just write in the chat right now, just like a major takeaway, maybe something from your breakout group right now that stood out from your time. Yeah, we have Kyle from Belfast. You're unmuted.
Oh, there we go. I didn't think it would let me unmute. Yeah. I was just everything you said was amazing, and I really appreciated it. Very encouraging. I think the thing that stood out overall is if we lose Jesus Christ in our focus, we lose everything.
That's a very good point, isn't it? Thank you. So what is it that we need to pick up, or what do we not pick up from pre-COVID times, I should ask rather? What are some things that you talked about in your group? Again, you can write in the chat or just put up a hand. What do we not want to pick up in a sense of not going back to normal? Question is if it ever was a normal. Dicky writes, also for us as YWAM, rethink program focus versus relationship into communities, focus on seeing what God is doing already. And Miranda is agreeing. What do we not need to pick up again? I think all the churches can ask the same question, what not to pick up apart from program. Yeah, Elaine?
I think we talked a little bit about how tricky it is not to pick up things again, because we are kind of longing to get back to how the familiarity, and also when we're involved with churches or other institutions who seem to want to go back to normal, then you almost feel like you're getting dragged along. Even if we learn some things, people are scared to stay in that unfamiliar place. And we talked about just the challenge of how you're brought along with the crowd really as you go back to church, and they go back into how things used to be. And actually that's quite depressing for me. I find that really challenging, because you want to hold on to the good that we learned, but other people want to go back to where it was before because that's what they know and that's safe and that's comfortable. And so it's really challenging to stay in that place of stepping away from the crowd. I guess we talked about that in my group.
Yes, we talked about that in our little group as well, a little staff group, you can say. So Roy, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that. You had a few comments there.
Well, I can certainly appreciate where Elaine's coming from. I think it's really difficult to lead people in a liminal place between what is and what may be. It's not as though we can give people a great vision and say it's going to look like this, it's going to be like that, we're going here. Actually, we don't know. We're in this in-between space. And I think leading in a period of liminality, exile, requires not so much just the prophetic that kind of analyzes and portrays and provokes, but we need the pastoral to understand how people feel very threatened by change. And people have been wearied and are anxious by the experience of COVID, and also the people who've been socially isolated from others. So we do need to find a way of actually being community together. But I just think this is a once in a lifetime opportunity for the church to stop doing what doesn't work, to take a really good hard look at, are we fulfilling the great commandment, loving God with heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving our neighbor as ourselves? And are we really fulfilling the Great Commission to go into all the world? We have an opportunity because it's almost like God, for me, shut the doors of the church buildings to get us out into the world. And now we're saying, no, we'll go back in and do attractional Christianity again. Attractional Christianity does not work. It relates to less than 5% of the population of all our European countries. So why would we put all our energies into reaching the 5% when, youth with a mission, the mission is to the world. The 95% are not going to be reached by doing what we've been doing before. And it seems to me that lockdown has just provided an opportunity for God to say, for goodness sake, stop what you're doing and think and ask the question, what does it mean to be the church? We've got an opportunity to be all non-conformists and actually not mirror the attitudes and the policies of the state and the ways of the world, and to discover once again what it means to be communities of hope. But it's a hard place, Elaine. It's a hard place. It's a really hard place. And it takes a great deal of wisdom and courage and compassion to be able to keep people in a liminal place, uncertain about what leadership is, the whole phase. We all go through phases in church. Vision setters. I mean, vision setters is what the business community was doing about 20 years ago, but the church got into about 10 years ago. It's very difficult now to be vision setters, because actually we're in a place where we should be asking more questions than delivering answers. How then shall we live? How do we seek God? How do we live out the gospel? We don't know, but God, take us on that journey by your Spirit, and keep our eyes, as Kyle said, fixed on Jesus, who is a pioneer, and pioneers break new ground.
Brilliant. Just keep the comments going on the side here in the chat, but we will move into a panel chat. So thank you for also responding here to Elaine's comment. So can we go into our panel now? We will have Jen, who gave a fantastic word there to start with, our reflection. To start with, we will have Roy in the panel. We will have Miranda Heathcote. We will have Ian.
Tova, whenever you come back to the world. So Tova was going to ask the first question, so now I'm going to ask the first question. So this is a question that kind of came to my mind as you were talking. I remember, Roy, in Milan at a Western Europe leaders gathering about 4 or 5 years ago, we had Neil Cole, who you've probably heard of. He kind of speaks about church, whatever, new church kind of stuff. He kind of gave this prophetic word at the very end about arcs, and that YWAM, he felt like YWAM was called to create arcs. And I felt like I've often shared that since, because I felt like it really connected with me as YWAM being a place that doesn't just run programs. You're talking about church, not just running programs, but getting out into the world, relating to people, loving people. And what would it be like if our YWAM bases became these kind of arcs of relationship, not just program-driven kind of institutions, but kind of places where people could feel belonging. I wonder, do you have any reflections? If we start maybe with you, Miranda, just what are some of your reflections on what Roy shared, and even this idea that I was kind of sharing there a little bit about, could YWAM bases be places where they kind of become arcs of belonging and places where people, even unchurched people, feel welcome? Do you want to speak into that? And then maybe Ian as well? Don't know if that's clear. You're muted, Miranda. Miranda, you're muted.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. I tried to unmute myself, but it's not possible. Hi, everybody. Hi, Roy. Yeah, well, in our breakout room, we were talking about just that, actually, about the difference between kind of having a community that we think of as an enclosed space that exists for its own programs and meetings and all the important things that we love to do, versus a community, well, getting out into the community, but also having spaces where we invite people in. So we were just talking about the importance of hospitality, which is great because that's our theme for the ELLC this month. But how those kind of bridging places, those invitational spaces, seem to happen most easily around food and meals and tables. So we were just wondering together at whether there's a greater invitation into hospitality in this next season, and what that would look like for us to be creating intentional spaces, not just kind of opening up the space with nothing kind of in our minds necessarily, but really being thoughtful and intentional, but making it easy for people to connect. So I don't know if that answers your question, Johnny, but that's what came to mind.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Miranda. Ian, any thoughts you've got?
Yeah, just really again struck by the idea of the Celtic Christianity model being that hub of a community, and just inviting people in to see life done as believers, and what does that look like? Because I don't know about you guys, but Seamill can often be the base up in the hill, which kind of gets a reputation for who knows what in the local community, because it's just hard for people to see inside the building. So yeah, it's a good question for us to say, well, in which ways do people legitimately see inside? Because it can really demystify an awful lot of stuff. Just I was struck by the Celts and how, whether it be hospitality, whether it be, just people coming in and seeing what they do, brought them to know Jesus. And so that should be the same for us, hopefully.
So Roy, obviously you're not a YWAMer as such, although, of course, I think you're very YWAMer. Well, maybe we're all Northumbrians, but what are some of your reflections on how an organization, or we'd like to call ourselves a movement, a tribe, how can we become more how can we create arcs of belonging, or is that something we should aspire to, and what would that look like?
Well, you describe yourself as a movement. I think any movement needs to continue to try to seek to be a movement rather than an institution. I think that's movements move. When movements stabilize and, they soon fossilize. So keep moving. I think when Ian was talking there about the Celts, in their enclosures, they weren't closed. They weren't a cloistered community, and there was the symbol. The Irish word is a muncher. That was their enclosure. If they built like a little village, but there was a thing called the open gate, it basically was an opening in the enclosure which didn't have a gate on it at all. And it was symbolic for the community to actually, our calling is to be in the world as well as in the community, in the world, in the community. And people could interact and become part of that community. I would say to YWAM, I hope you become a lot looser in terms of being very committed at the core, but a lot looser around the edges. So like with Northumbria, we have people who are not yet Christians who feel part of us as a community. They feel a sense of belonging. They feel welcome. They're the recipients of our hospitality. And I think the world needs more committed at the core, but looser at the edges communities. And I think YWAM is kind of ideally placed to be able to do that kind of stuff with your connections with people. The other thing for me is that actually, an ark for me speaks of a safe place. It's also a place of provision, of food. And that's why your month, is it a month theme, Miranda, on hospitality? I think hospitality is really what God is saying. The Fresh Expressions movement, they did a report from anecdote to evidence a few years ago now. And the fruitful initiatives in Fresh Expressions, the one dominant characteristic of all the fruitful expressions was hospitality. It's not rocket science, So all these amazing programs and amazing worship bands and great initiatives, actually, you could have saved a lot of money just by being hospitable and welcoming. And I think, it's a little while since I've been at Ancuin, but I think just that creating those communities of welcome and hospitality is pretty key to folk. The final piece I'd say on that is we assume that we're acting as the hosts, welcoming people, which is really important. But I think God turfing us out in lockdown has actually invited us to become more the guests with people. So we become guests at other people's tables as opposed to simply being the host. Johnny, very, very quick story. The other week, I was really tempted because we could have gone to church service that morning for the first time in ages into our local church here. And it's a great church, the Annick Baptist Church. But our neighbours, it was a lovely morning, and our neighbours next door, they were having coffee at breakfast outside, and we had been away. We'd been out of our house for ages because of the building work, and they said, "Roy, do you fancy joining us for a coffee?" So the answer was yes. I didn't even have to pray about it. I just went, and so I then had a cup of coffee, and then I had some toast, and I decided that actually, it was time. I probably should be thinking about going to a church service, but I didn't. And I spent the next hour and a half with my neighbors because the kingdom of God was there. The Spirit of God was working. And when I shared that with my pastors, they rejoiced and affirmed and encouraged me in the stance and decision that I had taken. And it was just great. It was just really good. And, I think that's a little silly example about just cooperating with what the Spirit of God is doing in your neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And being churches that are permission giving as opposed to controlling. We've got to get rid of all the flipping control that goes on in society and the church. Really do.
Amen. Tova, over to you.
Yeah, I just want to say amen to that as well. I was just thinking as you were sharing about, belonging, there was a quote from last week's hospitality leadership lounge where Alfonso said that hospitality is treating someone like they belong before they belong, until they belong. That was my favorite quote for that talk. It's just brilliant. So treating like they belong before they get there. But I have a question here. I think that's for you, Jen. So we are given the opportunity to stitch this new garment, and one that fits both humanity and nature. I love that from this quote from Sonia Taylor. But what garment would the Celts be stitching that would fit post-pandemic humanity and nature? So what do you think that they would be stitching that will fit post-pandemic humanity and nature?
Good question. Oh, well, I think it'd be a fair bit of crack, to be honest.
We need to interpret that for the Europeans.
It'd be a bit of
crack. What is crack?
Bit of fun, bit of.
Yes, it's not a drug. It's not a drug.
Not a drug. No, spelled differently.
That's an Irish word.
I think it's a good question. What garment would the Celts be stitching together? And I think for me, just to point back to something that Roy said that I found quite profound I think we're very used to being the ones wherein lies the answers, and perhaps that we should be more leaning towards what are the questions that we should be asking to change our posture from producing and creating and attracting to listening, serving, and welcoming. So I think that is the garment that probably humanity is ready to. We've shaken off maybe the jumper that was too tight, that we've outgrown, that's become a little bit suffocating, itchy, doesn't fit us anymore. And what are we going to create together? Let's make something big enough to where all people groups, regardless of identity, orientation, or anything, firstly, everyone is welcome. A garment that's big enough to include every expression of humanity in all of its various forms without changing, without augmenting itself in any way or having to subscribe to any sort of rule. I think something big enough that would cloak us all. And one that sort of turns its ear, I think, to listening, and instead of offering things, can just create a space of understanding, welcome, introspection, and listening, possibly. But I could be.
Yeah.
Very good.
That's great.
Do you want to add anything, Roy, to that?
Well, I love the imagery of the garments that Brené Brown talked about. I think, what else? Authenticity, a garment of authenticity that is real. I long for the church to be more a place where people are honest about the questions as opposed to always contending to try and deliver the answers. Because actually the watching world sees through the hypocrisy that we haven't got all the answers. We follow the one who is the way, the truth, and the life, but we haven't got all the truth and all the ways and all the life. I think friendship, you know, the spirit of the age is partisan, attritional, it's sectarian. And I think, you know, and again, I think YWAM is placed well with this to be able to wear the garment of friendship, as Jen said, across all the, you know, instead of putting restrictions on before people come in, let's just welcome people. And I think the fruit of the spirit, you know, the world needs people to demonstrate gentleness and peaceableness and kindness and goodness. You know, these things speak volumes because what they do is they speak Christ into the world. So yeah.
Thank you. I think we'll just end with that. that was beautiful. Yeah, thank you, Johnny.
Okay, well, guys, I think we're going to end the panel discussion there. I'm sorry, we could have gone on a long time, and we wanted a bit longer, but we're running a bit out of time, and we didn't want to lose that, to lose any of you. So I think we'll leave it there. But thanks, Miranda. We really always appreciate your wisdom. Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Jen. Of course, you're brilliant. And I just want to thank Roy. Thank you as well for joining us today, Roy. You know, I think you have sowed a bunch of really rich seeds in the soil of YWAM in Europe here, and I really hope these seeds can really germinate in our hearts and in our bases around Europe. And yeah, see us really move. As you said, I love that imagery of movements moving, and that's a good thing. So I think I'm just going to say a few words. Is this right, Tova? This is my moment? So I'm going to just say, probably many of you may have heard news, breaking news that Jen and I have decided, really after a number of months of reflection, to step out of YWAM. So I joined YWAM as a 7-year-old kid. My mom Val is there in the group. We left New Zealand to get on an airplane, a family of 4, as the youngest of 4, to join YWAM. And I've kind of never in my heart ever left. And of course, we may continue in forms in some way, have a connection, but we have felt the Lord leading us out. Over the last 25 years, since I did my DTS, I was influenced at a young age by reading Floyd McClung, talking about living on the devil's doorstep. And that led to us, Jen and I, moving into the Shankill Road in Belfast and trying to imagine what a DTS and what YWAM could look like in the midst of an inner city where there are walls that separate Protestants and Catholics. Instead of going to the nice places, what would it look like to incarnate the life of God in rough places? I love the way Roy talked about Celtic community there, because in some ways, although there's this beautiful imagery of this cross and it looks very romantic, I think the Celts were about incarnating in the world in which they lived. They didn't live in a fantasy world; they lived in the real world, and we are called to do that. And we feel, Jen and I, after all these years, after being in the Shankill for 8 years, and then we moved down here to Rostrevor 11 years ago. We moved to this beautiful space. We could live here forever, we really could. And I think that was the recognition we had a few months ago. We could live here forever. We're safe, and possibly we're on a plateau. And maybe God is calling us to pioneer once again and to move out of this safe place into the vulnerable space of moving out into the world. And I've taken on a role as the program manager for public theology, the Corrymeela Centre. Corrymeela is Ireland's oldest and largest peace and reconciliation organization. So I'm going to be keeping going on the trajectory that I've been going on, but just using a different vehicle. Jeff Fountain says public theology is what YWAM really needs to get a hold of in these days. He said public theology is what does the Bible have to say to Monday to Saturday? And, or his dad, Win Fountain, would have called the other 100 hours. What do we do with all these hours when we're not in church and not in a Bible study, but, we're out in the world? And what does theology have to do with Brexit and COVID and immigration? And so we're being invited maybe into a slightly in some ways not as big a space as YWAM, but in some ways bigger, if you can ever say that those things. And this is going to be my last Futurewise. So I guess, unless I somehow, there's a 6-month, probationary time with this job. So maybe, in 6 months, I'll come back with my tail between my legs, we're handing over the base here in Onkuin, this community to Scott Sotomayor and his wife, Yasmin, and a lovely leadership team. We're going to be moving out of YWAM Ireland, but we'll still stay connected in some ways. And I very much, how do you kind of leave YWAM? I don't know. We always say once a YWAMer, always a YWAMer. So I guess I'm still in. But at the same time, I think we all know that I'm taking a step out of a very real vehicle. And many YWAMers have been like brothers and sisters to me for years, and will continue to be, I think. So I just wanted to kind of share some thoughts as I step out of this space. But Futurewise, I think, is the sense of could YWAMers gather several times a year, listen to non-YWAM voices, and that speak into our mission and challenge us about the future. And I'm excited that Tova and others are going to continue on that path of exploring what the future holds to us in this mission. So I don't know if I've said that well enough, if there's anything else I need to say, but so thanks everyone, and for being here today. And I love YWAM. I've been part of this tribe for years, and we'll keep that way. So
thank you so much, Johnny, and Jen, and Daniel. Now I'm gonna cry as well. You can have one as well. Thank you so much, Johnny, for all you've done. We have had your farewell a little bit in Albania just the other week, so don't want to make a big speech here, but just really want to thank you for heading up Futurewise as well. So you gave life to this, and it's been a joy to work with you. And I think there's a little surprise coming in the door now. So thank you so much, Jasmine, for helping.
Aww.
So a little thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I
thought that was fun. I was about to shout.
And I think your mom want to say something too. It looks like.
Oh. I
Yeah.
can't speak.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Mom.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yes. So we'll probably pull you in again, Johnny, sometimes in the future, and hear what you're learning on your journey. Just want to, thank you from here. Of course, this recording here, you can also see it on the ELC, in the archives. So this will forever stay there. We will have Futurewise in the future. The next one we are looking at having on the 7th of February. You'll hear much more about that later. But thank you everyone for joining, and thank you, Johnny and Jen and Roy and everyone.